We have always been told that the Bible, as we know it, is complete, untouchable, and should never be questioned. But what if it were all a gigantic lie? Behind centuries of rewriting, censorship, and manipulation by those in power, much older texts might be hidden, writings that the Church has done everything to conceal from the rest of the world. Pre-canonical manuscripts, raw, disturbing, forbidden, containing ideas so explosive they could shake the very foundations of Christianity. And now an unexpected voice is reigniting the debate. Elon Musk.
He claims that this original Bible was deliberately buried, kept from the people. According to him, if these texts were to resurface, they could overturn everything we think we know about God, about humanity, and even about the future of faith. What they contain wouldn't just challenge belief, it could rewrite it entirely.
But this is where the story takes a darker turn. What most people don't know is that the biblical canon didn't appear overnight as a sacred collection ordained by God. It gradually took shape over the centuries as the early Christian communities in each region maintained their own lists of books considered authentic. The book of Revelation, the last text of the New Testament, wasn't written until 96 A.D. Even among the religious authorities of the time, several books eventually included in the New Testament were long contested. The letters to the Hebrews, the letters of James, and even Revelation itself were questioned by prominent theologians who wondered if they had truly been written by the apostles. The idea that there was a consensus on the biblical texts from the outset is therefore historically inaccurate. Yet, from that point on, Christian scribes worked tirelessly to collect and preserve what they believed to be the authentic writings.
But the original parchments were already deteriorating rapidly. Churches throughout the empire needed complete copies without delay, so thousands of manuscripts were produced and circulated. At that time, no central authority existed to verify which book was authentic and which was completely forged. It therefore took centuries of theological struggle to arrive at the biblical collection we know today. According to the documents Elon Musk is studying, as early as 95 A.D., 1 year before the book of Revelation was written, Clement of Rome, a disciple of the Apostle Peter, already possessed 10 texts that would later appear in the New Testament. 10 years later, Polycarp recognized 15 of them as sacred. 70 years later, Irenaeus validated 21 of them, then Hippolytus 22, and so on. These approved writings became what is known as the Muratorian canon. But a troubling question remains. What happened to all the rejected books? Hundreds of Gospels, letters, and prophetic texts circulated among the early Christian communities. The Gospel of Thomas, the Book of Enoch, the Acts of Paul, the Book of Revelation, and many others. For Musk, this vast collection of discarded texts represents fragments of the true original Bible, not the sanitized version we have received. If hundreds of Gospels and letters were already circulating in the first century, he argues, then early Christianity must have been far more complex, raw, and diverse. The real question, therefore, is not what was included in the official canon, but what they deliberately left out. In reality, these lost Gospels are far more complex than most people imagine. Some,
like the Gospel of Thomas, may preserve very ancient traditions, while others, like the Gospel of Judas, were clearly written centuries later as theological fictions. The problem was that ordinary believers had no way of distinguishing authentic writings from forgeries. They had to trust religious leaders who claimed authority to decide, without anyone really knowing if they weren't acting in their own self-interest. Because of this crisis, Musk explains, the first major controversy surrounding the original Bible erupted during the 2nd century. Fearing a complete fragmentation of Christianity, Eusebius, a historian and bishop of Caesarea, wrote detailed chronicles to justify which book deserved to be considered sacred. He then categorized the texts into 3 groups: canonical, disputed, and rejected. The canonical texts were those approved by the early church leaders, who had known first-hand witnesses of Jesus and the apostles. The disputed texts, however, were recognized only by some of the early church fathers, and their authenticity was debated. This was the case, for example, with the book of Revelation. As for the rejected texts, they were considered outright forgeries by those who had known the apostles personally. Later, St. Jerome provided a decisive clarification by translating the accepted texts into Latin. His selection became the basis of the Bible we still read today. But one detail continues to intrigue scholars. Jerome, a native of Bethlehem, had access to Hebrew and Greek manuscripts that have since been lost.
What if, even back then, the true teachings of Jesus had already been systematically erased? Elon Musk then poses the question everyone avoids. If so many texts circulated during the apostles' lifetimes, who decided what we have the right to read today? And why should we believe they made the right choices? The answer, he says, might just send a chill down your spine. The Emperor's Gamble. The blood was still fresh on Constantine's armor when he made the decision that would forever change the fate of Christianity. It was October 28, 312. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge had just ended. His rival, Maxentius, had drowned in the Tiber. Constantine was convinced that the Christian God had granted him victory after seeing before the battle a vision of a cross of light, accompanied by the words, "By this sign you will conquer." It was then that they converted to Christianity. But before that, Rome had waged a relentless war against Christians for nearly 3 centuries. Under Emperor Nero, they were burned alive like human torches. Under Decius and Diocletius, ferocious campaigns were launched to destroy Christian communities and burn their sacred scriptures. The carnage was so terrible that, according to historians, entire collections of authentic apostolic crises were lost forever during these persecutions. Yet Constantine's conversion was anything but an act of faith. It was a political maneuver. The man who claimed to have had a divine vision before the battle was only baptized on his deathbed 25 years later. For almost his entire reign, he remained a worshipper of Sol Invictus, the sun god. He had simply understood that Christianity was becoming the dominant religious force in the empire, and that Cyrillire would bring him immense political advantages. Musk sees in this move a maneuver as brilliant as it was terrifying. Constantine didn't truly convert to Christianity, Musk explains. He acquired it. Like any shrewd businessman, he saw which way it was heading and positioned himself to take control. But there's an interesting fact. While he didn't fully embrace it, he did everything he could to preserve what we now call the New Testament. By 325, growing divisions among Christians were threatening Constantine's imperial vision. He couldn't tolerate rival Christian factions weakening his authority.
Il convoqua donc le concile de Nicée pour trancher définitivement ces querelles. Il s'agissait en réalité de déterminer quelle version du christianisme survivrait et laquelle serait effacée à jamais. Le concile de Nicée établit le credo de Nicée, mais surtout il créa un précédent, celui où le pouvoir politique pouvait définir la vérité religieuse. Les évêques présents n'étaient pas des théologiens indépendants, ils étaient les invités de Constantin, dépendant de sa faveur pour leurs fonctions et souvent pour leur vie. La première liste complète des 27 livres du Nouveau Testament que nous connaissons aujourd'hui n'apparut qu'en 367 dans une lettre d'Athanas d'Alexandrie. C'était plusieurs décennies après la mort de Constantin et plus de 40 ans après le concile de Nicée. Mais une question glaçante se pose. Combien d'écrits apostoliques authentiques ont été volontairement écartés parce qu'ils ne servaient pas les intérêts politiques de Constantin? Nous savons que des dizaines d'évangiles et de lettres circulaient encore au IVe siècle. Certains prétendaient avoir été écrits par les apôtres et étaient reconnus par de grandes communautés chrétiennes. Mais nous savons aussi que Constantin et ses évêques avaient le pouvoir de déclarer tout texte gênant comme hérétique et d'en ordonner la destruction. La réalité effrayante, c'est que le christianisme que Constantin a légalisé pourrait être très différent de ce que Jésus enseignait réellement. Selon Musk, la Bible de Constantin n'avait rien à voir avec la préservation d'une révélation divine. Elle servait à programmer une religion destinée à soutenir sa soif insatiable de pouvoir impérial. Les livres qui ont intégré la Bible ne reflétaient peut-être pas la vérité divine, mais ce qui était politiquement commode. Et pourtant, le christianisme politique de Constantin n'était que le début. Au cours du millénaire suivant, une armée de moines allait s'employer sans relâche à faire en sorte que seules les versions approuvées des textes survivent. Et ce qu'ils ont fait pour préserver certains livres, tout en éliminant les autres, va vous choquer.
The scribes' conspiracy. Somewhere in the monasteries of medieval Europe, something disturbing was afoot. Behind those walls lived men and women who had dedicated their lives to religion, tasked with hand-copying the world's most sacred texts in special rooms called scriptoria. From the late 4th century onward, monastic communities became the guardians of Christian literature. In these candle-lit rooms, the monks worked primarily by hand, producing thousands of manuscript copies. But according to Musk, these medieval scriptoria were more like corrupted data centers, where every copy risked containing fatal errors. Imagine that every time you save a file, an unknown programmer could modify the code, he explains. That's exactly what happened to the Bible for over a millennium. Without a control system, without backups, and without any way to verify authenticity, the original source code of Christianity had been completely compromised. Copying thousands of words by hand in dimly lit rooms inevitably led to omissions, duplicated lines, and spelling mistakes. Some scribes even went so far as to modify the text, sometimes to make it clearer, sometimes for doctrinal reasons. But everything changed in the 12th century when Peter Lombard published his work entitled The Sentences, a theological manual that became the standard reference for Christian doctrine. Lombard's work relied heavily on texts once considered heretical or dubious. Suddenly, writings rejected by the early church fathers were treated as authoritative sources of Christian teaching. Thanks to Lombard's influence, the Church eventually adopted what would later be called the deuterocanonical or apocryphal books, writings like Tobit, Judith, the Wisdom of Solomon, and others excluded from the original biblical canon. These texts were now copied alongside the established scriptures and received the same authority. The medieval church had thus expanded the Bible to include books that early Christians had rejected, without the vast majority of believers having the slightest idea. Biblical manuscripts were rare and expensive, accessible only to ecclesiastical authorities and wealthy scholars. The people, however, were entirely dependent on what the priests told them the Bible contained. As mentioned earlier, these monks did not simply copy the text word for word. They were trained to correct passages deemed contrary to official doctrine. This happened so frequently that it gave the impression of a coordinated campaign to reshape the truth and ensure that only church-approved versions survived into modern times. Every manuscript that passed through the hands of monastic scriptoria could have been altered to support the institutional version of Christianity. But this dominance would soon be shaken. A German monk, also a professor, began to sense something strange in the way the church manipulated sacred texts. His investigation would uncover centuries of deception. His name was Martin Luther. What Luther discovered was so astounding that even he could not have imagined the extent of what had been concealed from the believer. Could one man's quest for truth truly bring down an institution that had controlled information for over 1,000 years? The coming revolution would tear apart the carefully woven web of Christian truth that the monasteries had created. But it would also reveal that the corruption ran far deeper than anyone could have dared to imagine.
The Reformers' Revelation.
The sound of hammering echoed through Wittenberg when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church on October 31, 1517. He wanted every scholar entering the church to at least take the time to read them. But this wasn't simply a complaint about the corruption of the church. It was the beginning of a war over Christianity's most dangerous question. What did the original biblical texts actually say? Luther was furious because he had discovered that the church was using as scripture books that the early Christians had never acknowledged. The canonical books of doctrine, surreptitiously added to the biblical canon by medieval monasteries, were now being used to justify practices that contradicted the clear teaching of the authentic apostolic writings. So how had these dubious texts acquired such authority? But Luther's discovery went far beyond that. He had access to Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, older and far more reliable than those used by the Roman Catholic Church. These manuscripts revealed that several passages supporting papal authority, purgatory, or salvation by works were either mistranslated or entirely absent from the oldest texts. Church leaders were terrified. If people could read the Bible for themselves in their own languages, they would discover that much of what they were being taught was not based on the apostolic writings, but on medieval versions, mistranslations, or even outright forgeries. When Luther was outlawed by the church, he embarked on the most dangerous translation project in history. He wasn't simply translating from Latin into German. He was going back to the oldest available manuscripts to find the exact words of the biblical authors. Rather than accepting the expanded canon of the church, he returned to the 66 books recognized by the early Christian communities. He translated the canonical books separately, specifying that they could be useful for reading, but should not serve as the basis for doctrine. The invention of the printing press further amplified the impact of Luther's work. For the first time, identical copies of the Bible could be mass-produced and distributed throughout Europe. This technological revolution not only spread Luther's translation, but also enabled a growing number of people to interpret the scriptures for themselves, sparking an explosion of Protestant movements. In 1534, Luther completed the full translation of the biblical text, and the effect was immediate and devastating to the authority of the church.
Those who could finally read the Bible for themselves discovered that many of the teachings they had received were nowhere to be found in the original texts. The spread of Luther's translation throughout Europe sparked a veritable revolution in reading. People learned to read precisely so they could study the scriptures, and what they found there challenged their entire certainty about the Christian faith. But the church's reaction was swift and brutal. Jan Hus, a fervent supporter of Luther's ideas, was excommunicated, and his followers were executed. Michael Sattler was tortured and killed for placing the authority of the Bible above ecclesiastical tradition. William Tyndale was burned alive for translating the scriptures into English, and the list goes on. Feeling his life threatened, Luther took refuge in Warburg Castle. What is often overlooked is how closely the debates surrounding the biblical canon were intertwined with executions and political power. The religious authorities didn't see the reformers as mere theological opponents. They viewed their work as a direct threat to their political control. Why should ordinary people have the right to read the sacred texts for themselves? It was literally a matter of life and death. Luther and the other reformers used textual criticism and historical analysis to expose centuries of manipulation, while the religious authorities employed violence to protect their version of Christian truth. But Musk went even further. He poses the uncomfortable question that even Luther couldn't answer. Each reformer believed they had rediscovered the original truth, but if they couldn't agree among themselves on which books to consider authentic, didn't that mean none of them truly had access to the real source code? Luther was undoubtedly a revolutionary genius, but he was still working with altered data.
John Calvin, in turn, developed the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, the idea that the original manuscripts contained no errors. His followers eventually considered the 66 books perfect and complete, rejecting any suggestion that any authentic apostolic writings might have been lost or suppressed. In 1826, Protestant Bible societies completely ceased printing the books of the Austro-canonical canon, reverting to the canon of 66 books recognized by the early Christians. At this point, a troubling question arises. If the Church had erred about which books to include in the Bible, what else might it have erred about? And most importantly, what other authentic apostolic writings might still be waiting to be rediscovered? The answer would emerge from the most unexpected place.
The Dead Sea Scrolls was 1947 when a young Bedouin shepherd, searching for a lost goat near Qumran, made a discovery that would revolutionize everything we thought we knew about the Bible. But what he found in that cave, inside an old clay jar, wasn't just ancient manuscripts. It was proof that the Church had hidden the truth about the original biblical canon for nearly 2,000 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't dusty old books, but actual time capsules left by a Jewish community called the Essenes in the 1st century. They contained the very manuscripts that Jews were reading in the time of Jesus. The Hebrew texts found at Qumran were more than 95% identical to modern translations. The book of Isaiah, for example, showed a text virtually unchanged from copies written more than a millennium later. This proves the Jewish scribes had demonstrated remarkable accuracy in transmitting scripture. But the remaining 5%, spelling errors and theological differences, would have enormous consequences for Christian doctrine. Even more troubling, the Qumran community had also preserved several decanonical books later rejected by Protestant churches: the Book of Sirach, the Letter of Jeremiah, and other texts that early Jewish communities clearly considered sacred. So if these ancient Jews saw these writings as inspired, why did Christians later reject them? You see, the presence of apocryphal writings among the Qumran manuscripts proves that these texts were read, studied, and valued in ancient Jewish circles, even if they weren't placed on the same level as the Torah or the prophetic books. Their existence shows that the notion of religious authority was far more nuanced than subsequent Christian debates between canonical and non-canonical texts have suggested. In other words, if 1st century Jewish communities were reading sacred texts absent from our current Bibles, then our idea of what constitutes true scripture might be completely wrong. The Church would then have some explaining to do. For Elon Musk, the Dead Sea Scrolls represent irrefutable proof that the original Bible was far broader and more diverse than modern churches are willing to admit. Quote, "Here we have 1st century religious communities reading books and letters that our so-called complete Bible doesn't even mention," he asserts. If these people considered sacred texts we don't know about, then our Bible isn't original. It's a heavily edited version, unquote. Even more shocking, the scrolls reveal that the community of Qumran did not have a fixed canon. It used a fluid collection of sacred writings, including books we recognize, others we have rejected, and even texts that have completely disappeared. But most importantly, these manuscripts prove that multiple versions of the same book were already circulating in the 1st century. Some scrolls contain expanded versions of known books with additional chapters and verses. Others tell the same stories, but with marked theological differences. And the most terrifying question is this: if multiple versions of the same book existed at that time, how can we know that the Church chose the correct ones? And if the suppressed versions actually preserved more authentic traditions than those we know, the Dead Sea Scrolls have opened a door that the Church will never be able to close. They have given rise to the idea that other authentic apostolic writings still lie buried in desert caves or beneath ancient ruins. But the most disturbing thing is that the Church would have always known. She reportedly had access to archaeological discoveries and manuscripts proving that the biblical canon is incomplete, while continuing to teach that the current 66 or 73 books represent God's complete revelation to humanity. Today, 3 billion people call themselves Christian,
but they may be following a religion that no longer resembles the one Jesus actually taught. The biblical text is available in more than 400
English translations from 20,000 ancient fragments constitute one of the best documented writings in history. And yet, this same evidence shows that our canon is incomplete, altered, and perhaps even corrupted beyond recognition. The rejected New Testament books, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Acts of Paul, were not discarded because they were false, but because they challenged the power structures of the institution. Excluded Old Testament texts like Tobit, Maccabeus, or the Wisdom of Solomon suffered the same fate, not for lack of historical reliability, but because they supported practices such as praying for the dead or salvation by works, contrary to official doctrine. The Dead Sea Scrolls thus shattered the Church's narrative of biblical authority. They prove that ancient Jewish communities possessed a far larger collection of sacred writings than those recognized today. They had books we know nothing about, and other versions of texts we thought we knew. And what Elon Musk emphasizes is that this story transcends religion. It reveals a universal pattern. Powerful institutions have always tended to suppress information that threatens their authority. Musk sees in the censorship of these texts the same reflex he observes in modern society. Governments suppressing inconvenient data, and technological platforms controlling the flow of information. According to him, it was this same instinct that drove the early church to bury the true original Bible. They knew that if people saw the whole picture, their version of reality would crumble. The truth, he says, is out there, hidden in desert caves and ancient libraries, waiting for technology and human curiosity to unleash it. And when that happens, it won't just be Christianity that changes, but perhaps all of humanity. So, what do you think? Are these suppressed texts the true spiritual foundations of humanity, hidden for centuries? Or should we believe that religious authorities have preserved from the beginning exactly what we needed to know? Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications.